Good evening, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. Tonight it's a big night because we are concluding our study of the book of Colossians. So we've spent like 3 weeks, 2.5, 3 weeks, something like that, looking at this just really beautiful book that exalts Jesus in such a powerful way. And tonight we're going to come to the conclusion of this book. And so Paul ends this book the way that he ends many of his books, and that is with a series of greetings, both to and from certain people. So we're going to get a little picture into the life of Paul and get to meet some of the people that were important to him, to his ministry, and to the life of the congregation in Colossae. So, it's good to see everybody. Looks like we've got a handful of people on. Looks like the Pennells. Good evening to y'all, and Sherry, and Sharon, and family, and Sister Shelba, and Brother Junior, and Sister Yvette, and Brother Dan. I'm so thankful that each of you have joined with us. As always, please throw a comment in so I know you're here. And like and share the video. Always helps to get the word out. As I mentioned last time, I know I had one person, Sister Tilly, had asked about the book of James, so we may end up doing that. But if there's any other questions or just thoughts that you have or topics that you'd like to kind of dig into or books of the Bible that you'd like to look at, please let me know. And, maybe we can incorporate some different things over the next couple of weeks or the next, however long this lasts. And who knows, we may keep doing this some. I don't know about every night, but we may keep doing it some even after things return to normal. There was another thought that I had, another thing I wanted to let you know before we get into... we may do is, tomorrow night is Wednesday, so we'll be looking at our Theology for Dummies at 7 o'clock. Hey Casey, hope that you and Faith and the family are doing well. But what we may do is look at Philemon actually on Thursday, because Philemon goes with, as we'll learn tonight, goes with Colossians very, very closely. And as a result, there's a lot of the same people are involved, and so I think we may end up actually looking at Philemon before we go elsewhere. But please let us know about any other topics or books or anything else that you'd like to look at, and we will certainly take a look at some of those. So, real quick, let's go over to our Bibles, and what we're going to do first is just go through the rest of Colossians, chapter 4, starting with verse 7 down to verse 18, which is the end of the book. So, read along with me if you would. Paul writes, and he says, "As to all my affairs, Tychicus, our beloved brother and faithful servant and fellow bondservant in the Lord, will bring you information, for I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know about our circumstances and that he may encourage your hearts. And with him, Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of your number. They will inform you about the whole situation here. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, sends you his greetings, and also Barnabas' cousin Mark, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And also Jesus, who is called Justus. These are the only fellow workers for the kingdom of God who are from the circumcision, and they have proved to be an encouragement to me. Epaphras, who is one of your number, a bondslave of Jesus Christ, sends you his greetings, always laboring earnestly for you in his prayers, that you may stand perfect and fully assured in all the will of God. For I testify for him that he has a deep concern for you and for those who are in Laodicea and Hierapolis. Luke, the beloved physician, sends you his greetings, and also Demas. Greet the brethren who are in Laodicea, and also Nympha, and the church that is in her house. When this letter is read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans. And you, for your part, read my letter that is coming from Laodicea. Say to Archippus, take heed to the ministry which you have received in the Lord, that you may fulfill it. I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. Remember my imprisonment. Grace be with you." As we read a section of Scripture like this, it is easy for us to sort of gloss over it or to feel like, well, this doesn't have anything to say to me after all. Paul's just listing a bunch of names, and I don't know who any of these people are, so what's the point? But I would recommend us taking the time to actually look at these names and tease out what we may learn about them, what we may be able to know about them. I think there's some worthwhile things that we can learn about each of these individuals. So that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to go through and we're going to look at who these people were and how they were important, how they were valuable to Paul's ministry here. So let me pull up my... Oh, did not mean to do that. And there's no way to override it. I apologize. We'll be with you here in a second. Okay, so here we are. We find ourselves looking at this this final patch of text. We've got a handful of people that we're going to look at. The first one is Tychicus. Now, Tychicus is the one who is carrying the letter. Paul is in Ephesus when he's writing this, or at least that's what we think. Paul is imprisoned in Ephesus, and he's written this letter, and he's now sent it to this congregation in Colossae. And there's more going on behind the scenes that maybe we don't quite, might not be apparent right away, that we'll see here in a moment. But Tychicus is the one who is with Paul and who is being sent. And Paul, gives us a little bit of information about him. He says that he's a beloved brother, that he's a faithful servant, and that he is a fellow bondservant. This is someone, it is obvious, that Paul trusts. And we know Paul trusts him because if you'll remember at the very beginning of Colossians, Paul has never been to Colossians. He's not met the people in this congregation. And he is sending Tychicus to go to them and to sort of represent him. So Paul has to have at least enough confidence in him to make him his representative, basically to introduce Paul and his ministry to this congregation in a very tangible way. So Paul has to have a lot of confidence in him. We also know that he has some confidence in him because we read about him. If you go over to Acts chapter 20 and you read verse 4, you'll read about him, and he's one of the ones who's with Paul and spends some time with him, helps to minister alongside him. We also read about him in 2 Timothy in the book of Titus. And in all three of these places, Tychicus is somebody who goes with Paul, who is serving alongside him, ministering, and who Paul is using as a ambassador for himself, that he's sending him out to go and to represent him, and ultimately to represent God in the kingdom, but to represent his ministry to these various places. So this is somebody that for most of us, even for those of us that have grown up in the church, we probably have not heard a lot about this guy, and yet he was someone who was key to Paul's ministry and was heavily involved, and who has this beautiful testimony of being a beloved brother and of being a faithful servant, and who was willing to serve, who was a fellow bondservant, was willing to serve in ministry alongside Paul. And so this is somebody who has been faithful. And what it reminds us of is, it's really easy, I think, for us in the church, and we talked about this a little bit last night, it's easy for us to kind of have a celebrity mentality almost, even for those of us within the church, that we look at the pastor, or we look at the person who's in charge, and they sort of get all of the focus. And what Tychicus reminds us of is that there are a lot of behind-the-scenes workers who are doing this faithful ministry, who are beloved brothers, who are fellow bondservants, alongside those ministers, those more visible pastors and evangelists and missionaries. And there are these men and women who are working right alongside and who are faithful and who might not get the name recognition, who might not be out in front of everybody, and yet they are so important to the work of the ministry going forward. This is something that this last section of Colossians should drive home for us, that it's not just about the person who's in the pulpit. It's not just about the person who's up, standing and proclaiming the word, on Sunday morning. It's not just about the person who's up there singing. It's about everyone coming together and working together to build the kingdom, to get the message out, and it takes all of us to accomplish that. We can't do it with just one person. And even Paul, as gifted as he was, and as filled with God's Spirit as he was, and as, everything else as Paul was, he could not fulfill the ministry God had given him all on his own. He needed the help of others. And this is, like I said, this is one of the things that in the closing of this letter should drive home for us. And it's an important one because we live in a day and age and a place where celebrity pastors are what it's all about. And we all kind of have this picture of one man doing the ministry and everybody else sitting back and watching the show. And for Paul, that's not the way that it was. for the early church, that's not the way that it was. So Paul has got this guy who has been faithful, who's shown himself faithful in little, and now Paul has entrusted him with more and more. He's been a beloved brother, and as a result, Paul is sending him. And he says, listen, I've sent him for this very purpose, that you may know about our circumstances and that he may encourage your hearts. In other words, like I said a moment ago, Tychicus is the one who is representing Paul to this congregation, to a congregation who has never met Paul in the flesh, who only has heard of him, has known of him. If you'll remember at the very beginning of the letter, Paul says he's not the one who founded this church, but Epaphras is the one who shared the gospel here and who started this congregation. So, Tychicus was a key part of Paul's ministry team, and he's being sent to represent Paul in his ministry. So Paul has to have a tremendous amount of confidence in him. Now, notice who else is with him. He's got this other name, Onesimus, who you may know if you've read the book of Philemon. What we gather from the book of Philemon is basically Onesimus was a slave belonging to Philemon, who ran away and who escaped, and who ended up getting to know Paul. And Paul shared the gospel with him, and he got saved. And when he got saved, Paul, and him, they decide that Onesimus needs to go back to Philemon, who is his master. And so Paul sends the book or the letter of Philemon, the one that we call Philemon in our Bibles. He sends that letter with Onesimus back to Onesimus' master, and he gives him some wonderful encouragement there. He encourages Philemon to treat Onesimus as a brother and not as a slave. And this is really important. This plants the seeds for the ending of slavery in the West. Because you can't treat someone as a brother and own them as a slave and treat them as a slave as well. This is planting the seeds to the end of slavery. And so this is why this letter, though short, Philemon, though a short letter, is a really important letter. That's why we may go ahead and look at it, because it's highly likely that Tychicus and Onesimus are bringing both the letter to the Colossians and the letter to Philemon at the same time, that these letters are being carried there. And that Paul is sending Tychicus because he wants almost somebody as a mediator with Onesimus. Because you can imagine if Philemon has lost his slave and now he's coming back, he may be angry. And so I think maybe that Paul's got Tychicus in mind there as someone who can help kind of smooth things over, represent Paul, be that voice of reason, and try and help Philemon see what he needs to do. And so he delivers both of these letters at the same time. Highly likely that this is the case. Now notice the way he describes Onesimus, that he is a faithful and beloved brother who is one of your number. He belongs to the Colossians. He's from Colossae because he was a slave of Philemon who lived in Colossae. And he says both of them, both Onesimus and Tychicus, will inform you about the whole situation here. And so Paul is really giving some authority, not really authority, but he's lending credibility to Onesimus and saying, look, both of them are going to let you know what's going on with me, what's going on with my ministry here in Ephesus. So you can see that Paul is he is an advocate for Onesimus. Because, like I said earlier, it would be easy for Philemon to get angry with everything that had gone on. So, these are our two people who are bringing this letter, who are going back to the city of Colossae, and who are going to meet the congregation there and share this whole, letter and everything that, we'll get to that in a minute. So, who's next? He says, we got Aristarchus, who is a fellow prisoner, and he says he sends you his greetings. So Paul is likely a prisoner here in Ephesus for the ministry that he's doing, and Aristarchus is somebody who's with him, who has also been in prison. You can actually read about Aristarchus over in Acts chapter 19, and in Acts 19 we read about this big to-do that happens in the city of Ephesus. Paul's there with a number of other ministers, and they are sharing the gospel, and there are people in Ephesus who don't like this because it's cutting into their economic profit. There are some people who are creating idols, and as people are getting saved and turning to the invisible God, all of their idol business is sort of drying up, and they're having issues, and so they get really angry. They start a bit of a riot in town, and Paul is mentioned along with Aristarchus in Acts chapter 19. Aristarchus is said to be one of Paul's fellow ministers who were there, and so both of them, it appears, were imprisoned. And Paul is telling the Colossians that Aristarchus, he is with them, and that he too is sending his greetings. And then notice who else is with them. Mark. Now, you may know Mark. If you know your New Testament, you probably have heard about Mark. In fact, tradition tells us that Mark is the one who wrote the Gospel of Mark, that he was a associate and a friend of Peter, and that he helped, that Peter sort of gave him a lot of the information that we find in the Gospel of Mark. That's what Christian tradition says. But notice what else we read, and actually let me erase what I've got so far so we can see a little bit better. He calls him Barnabas' cousin, Mark. Now, if you read the book of Acts, you'll read about a story where Paul and Barnabas, after Paul gets saved, Barnabas is sort of his advocate. He comes alongside of Paul. He encourages the other Christians to accept Paul, to believe that Paul really had been converted, that Paul wasn't just out to kill them, because remember, Paul had been a persecutor of the Christians. And so Paul and Barnabas become close friends and close associates, and they begin to go minister out into the larger community. I mean, they go on missionary excursions together. And there's this one missionary excursion where they bring this Mark, and they get going, and all of a sudden Mark wants to turn back and leave and kind of abandons them. And the next time that they go out, Barnabas wants to bring Mark, and Paul's like, no, he left last time that he was with us. He just left us. I don't want to bring him. We can't rely on him. And so this ends up sort of dividing, creates a little bit of a rift between Paul and Barnabas. And Paul ends up going with Silas and continuing ministry work. And Barnabas ends up going with Mark and continuing ministry work. And so the work is ultimately multiplied. So it turns out to be God uses it, even though it's a bit of a rift, to good effect. But it's significant that Mark is mentioned here. And the significant thing is, remember, Paul was not crazy about Mark being involved in the ministry because he didn't feel like he was trustworthy. And yet here he is, Paul not only mentioning Mark, but commending him. And notice what he says, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. It sounds like that perhaps Mark had a bit of a cloud over him, that maybe because of what happened with him and Paul and Barnabas, or maybe there was something else that happened. We don't really know. But it sounds as though maybe there was a little bit of a cloud over Mark. And as a result, Paul is rehabilitating Mark. He's encouraging them to receive Mark and not to look down on him for what had happened. And this is a good reminder for us that stuff happens. And that sometimes people make mistakes and people make missteps and people go down wrong paths and stuff happens. And we need to be willing, like Paul, to get past some of that and be willing to receive people who maybe have made some poor choices in the past, or who have made mistakes in the past, or who have just disappeared when you needed them. Paul is willing to receive Mark. And so this is, to me, an encouraging thing, because I don't know about you, but I know for me, there's been times in my, life where I have made some missteps, and there have been things that, I've had to go back to, even pastors that I, especially when I first got saved, I've shared before, I was very hard and very critical of people. I mean, very, very critical of anyone who didn't think just like me. And as a result, I didn't always treat those in leadership very well, because they weren't just like me, and because they did some things that I didn't necessarily agree with. And I've had to go back and apologize for the way that I had acted to them. And I'm thankful that they were like Paul and were willing to receive me rather than being angry for what I had done. At least they didn't act angry. So this is an encouraging word that we have here, that Paul was willing to receive Mark and I think rehabilitate him. And like I said, if we follow Christian tradition, Mark would go on to write his gospel. And so just because somebody makes some missteps doesn't mean that God can't use them. On the contrary, God is faithful. and he can take even the worst of circumstances and bring about good from it. And that's one of the things that this verse here in Colossians reminds us of. So the next person we read about is Jesus, who is called Justus. Look, Jesus was a very common name in the first century, this area where Jews were. After all, this is the name of one of the heroes of the faith, Joshua. In the Old Testament, the name Joshua is the same as what we find in the New Testament is Jesus. It's just that Joshua is translated from the Hebrew and Jesus is translated from the Greek. But these are the same names. And so there were a lot of people named Jesus at the time, or named, Yehoshua. And he very often, when somebody, if there was a Christian who was named Jesus, they would also go by another name to differentiate them from their Lord. So we don't know a whole lot about him. In fact, he's, I think, one of the only ones in this ending to Colossians that is not also mentioned in Philemon. So we don't know a whole lot about him, but we do know that he's with Paul, that he was a fellow minister. And again, what this reminds us of is the fact that we're all needed, that even if we don't have the name recognition like he does, he didn't have a whole lot of name recognition, certainly not like Paul or even like Mark or Barnabas or any of these other guys, and yet he was mentioned because he was a faithful servant and because he was a part of this ministry that Paul was doing. And again, it should remind us that that everyone is needed in the body to accomplish ministry. Now notice what he says right after this. These are the only fellow workers for the kingdom of God who are from the circumcision. The circumcision is often used by Paul to refer to Jews. So this is why most people believe, scholars have traditionally believed that Luke was a Gentile, because Paul's going to mention Luke down here, and right here he says these are the ones who were part of the circumcision. These were the ones who were Jews. And so that's why we think that Luke was a Gentile, because he's not mentioned among these guys. So these were the ones who had been Jewish, who were Jewish Christians. And notice what Paul says, they have proved to be an encouragement to me. Now, I think probably the reason that they were an encouragement to Paul was because Paul really wanted, as we read in Romans 9 through 11, Paul desperately wanted his fellow Jewish brothers and sisters to come to faith in Jesus. And every, I think, fellow Jew that came to faith was a tremendous encouragement to Paul. I mean, think about it in your own life. Though we are excited when anyone comes to faith, there is, because of our own, just the way that we are, those that are of our own family, we have a particular burden for because of our closeness to them. And the same was true of Paul. So I think that's probably why they were such an encouragement, because it was sort of this, there was this kinship that was going on. Now, let us continue. Next, we have Epaphras, who you'll remember from a moment ago. He was the one who founded the church in Colossae, who had shared the gospel here, and who was involved in ministry in this place. He says, look, he's one of your number, which means he was from Colossae. He was a Colossian. He was a bond slave of Jesus Christ. This is a phrase that Paul uses often to refer to himself, very often at the beginning of letters. In fact, probably at the beginning of Colossians, Paul will open the letter and call himself a bond slave of Jesus Christ. This is the way he describes Epaphras, because he was a fellow minister. He says he sends you his greetings, and he is, now listen to this. This is really good. As I was reading this, I was a little bit convicted. Maybe not a little bit, maybe a lot. He's always laboring earnestly for you in his prayers, that you may stand perfect and fully assured in all the will of God. Notice what he says here, that he is earnestly laboring. So we have this very intense kind of language, that this is is work. And what is he doing? In his prayers. And what this brings out is the same thing that we talked about last night. The importance in Paul's mind and in Paul's life of prayer for the work of ministry. Paul sees prayer, from what we read here at the end of Colossians in this 4th chapter, Paul sees prayer as the engine for ministry. That prayer is the thing that is driving them. Prayer is the thing that is keeping them going. Prayer is the thing that gives them the words to say. Prayer is the thing that enables the believers to stand perfect and fully assured in the will of God. And so, as a minister, prayer should be at the forefront of our minds, and yet so often it's easy to get caught up in the work of ministry and to lose sight of that. And yet when we go back and we read Acts chapter 6, it's right there. If you read Acts chapter 6, there's this sort of discussion that takes place because all of the apostles are getting caught up in serving tables. And they said, this is when they appoint deacons to take care of this. They say, because we want to devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word. And from that right there, we see this twin focus, this importance of prayer in the ministry of the word. Now, why is this so important? It's not just important for us as, those who are pastors or those who are involved in Christian leadership, but what it should bring out is the importance and the value of prayer for ministry as a whole. And so when somebody feels like, well, I can't contribute to ministry because I don't know how to teach, or, maybe I'm incapable of teaching, or maybe I'm getting to the age where I have a hard time even getting out of the house. I know some people who are in that kind of a situation, and hey, right now we're all in the situation not being able to get out of the house. But I know some people who are, shut-ins, and as a result, they can't just go and do ministry, and people who have a real heart for ministry. And what this should remind us of is that prayer is not a lesser ministry. Prayer is not something that is sort of, well, if you can't do anything else, then at least you can pray for the ministry. Prayer is not this thing that is a secondary thing. Prayer is a primary thing. It is the engine that drives everything else. And if we don't have people who are involved in prayer, I don't think anything else is going to work. I mean, are the sermons going to be effective if they're not bathed in prayer? Are the ministry efforts that we expend going to work if they aren't bathed in prayer? Prayer is the foundation for everything else. If we're not connected with God through prayer, I don't think anything else is going to work. Prayer is the thing that not only makes the ministry effective, it's vital for us as we seek to live for God. I mean, that's what Paul's saying here at the end of this verse. So as I was reading this today, it just really drove home this point that prayer is not a secondary ministry. It is a primary ministry. And so even if the only ministry that you have is that you can devote yourself to prayer, that is not a bad thing in any way. That is a phenomenal thing, and we need to recognize it as such, and we need to, I think, lift the value of this. And I'm not really sure how exactly we do that, but I think as congregations, we really need to exalt the importance and the value of prayer to our ministry efforts, to our worship services, to everything that we do as Christians. Paul obviously did. When you read this last chapter of Colossians, prayer comes up again and again and again, and it seems to be the thing that he's most concerned with for really being the engine to drive the rest of everything they do. And I'm just not sure that we view it the same way that Paul did. I think that maybe sometimes we underestimate the importance and the value of prayer to the life of the local congregation, to the life of the kingdom as a whole. So let us continue. I'm going to pull up. I'm going to do this right here so we can see the rest of the chapter. Okay. Yes, Sherry. Verse 12, let's see. Yes. Yeah, the Andrew Murray book has been so good. I don't know if anybody has had an opportunity to read it, but Andrew Murray's book, With Christ in the School of Prayer, is just a phenomenal look at what Jesus had to say about prayer. And I guess maybe that's kind of been on my mind as well as I've been reading through that. As I came to this, I just thought, man, I have not given... I have not made prayer the priority in my ministry like it should be. And it was a very convicting moment for me as I was reading through this and just really thinking about what Paul says here. So, let's see. Notice what he says right after this. He says, I testify for him that he has a deep concern for you and for those who are in Laodicea and Hierapolis. Now, it's clear right here that Epaphras was not just the pastor of this congregation in Colossae, but instead he was sort of a missionary who had planted churches and been involved in churches in all of these areas. And just so you can get a geographic picture of where all these things are, here is a map, and this shows you Colossae is down here, and then Hierapolis is right here, and Laodicea is down here. You may remember from, if you've done much studying on the book of Revelation, there are 7 letters that open the book of Revelation up in chapters 2 and 3. And in that letter, you'll have or in that section, you have a letter to the Laodiceans where he says, you're neither hot nor cold. The reason he says you're neither hot nor cold is because both Hierapolis and Colossae, if I'm not mistaken, these are the 2 cities that one of them had a hot springs and one of them had a cool springs, and the water would get piped into Laodicea, and by the time it got to Laodicea, it was no longer either hot or cold. Instead, it was lukewarm, and it was disgusting because nobody wants lukewarm water. Am I right? At least I don't like lukewarm water. I love hot, for tea or coffee. I love cold, but lukewarm, not so good. So we see both of these cities mentioned here. It's obvious that Epaphras was involved in the congregations, in all of these different congregations. And Laodicea is going to come up again here in a second. So notice who else we've got. We got Luke, who we mentioned already. This is the reason that we believe Luke was a Gentile, because he wasn't included in that number of the circumcision. Luke, who is a physician. This is the only place in the Bible where Luke is referred to as a physician, so this is how we know that he is a doctor. And he says he sends you his greetings. Luke is also the one that, again, Christian history tells us, wrote the gospel according to Luke, as well as the book of Acts. And so if you read the book of Acts, you'll actually find, starting about, probably a little over halfway through, that Luke begins to use we, and just out of nowhere, he'll be talking about Paul, describing Paul's journey, and all of a sudden he'll start to say, we did this, we did that. That's because Luke and Paul were close traveling companions, and Luke was involved in a lot of the events, especially in the latter half of the book of Acts, in his history there. So Luke is mentioned here. Luke was, again, very close to Paul, and also Demas. And Demas has kind of a disappointing story. He's only mentioned a couple of times in the New Testament. He's mentioned here. He's mentioned in Philemon, which, remember, these letters were sent at the same time. And he's also mentioned in the book of 2 Timothy, chapter 4. And I actually want to read this to you because it's a little bit depressing. But it serves as an important warning. In 2 Timothy, chapter 4, verse 10, Paul is talking about, this is the way he closes his letter to Timothy. And he says, he opens this final section off with verse 9, make every effort to come to me soon, for Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia, only Luke is with me. So from this here, we find out that Demas did not have such a positive ending. Though he was involved in Paul's ministry early on, and even here in this letter to the Colossians, he eventually would leave Paul, would desert him, and Paul says that he loved this present world. And so a sad tale. We don't know what exactly happened. We don't know really anything else about him other than this mention here, one very short one in Philemon, and then that over in 2 Timothy. But it is a warning to us that, people are people. And unfortunately, that means that sometimes they make poor decisions, and sometimes we will be abandoned. And that is what happened to Paul, as we find out there in 2 Timothy. It's really just a tragic ending to that letter, as Paul describes himself, basically saying, everybody's left me. Luke's the only person that's still here. I don't know if you've ever felt that way. I know I have, and reading 2 Timothy during a time like that was encouraging because it was a reminder that, I'm not alone. Paul went through similar situations, and I'm thankful that God, even when everybody else has abandoned us and left us, that God stands with us. In fact, that's what Paul says towards the end of that chapter, is that the Lord stood with him. And that's the encouraging word, that even when the Demas in our life leaves us high and dry, we have a God who remains with us and who is faithful. Now, Paul gets towards the end of this section, and he says to greet those who were in Laodicea. Remember what I said a moment ago, that Laodicea and Hierapolis are not that far from Colossae. So he says to greet them, those that are in Laodicea, and also this person Nympha. Now there's been some debate about whether Nympha is a woman or a man, because there are, in the manuscripts, There are some that use a masculine form of this name, and some of them use a feminine form of this name. So whether this is a male or female, we aren't sure. But I think, personally, I think the evidence probably leans more towards a woman, though certainly is not, conclusive. But notice what it says, greet her and the church that is in her house. This brings out two important things. The first is that the place of women in the early church is very, very important. In fact, according to Rodney Stark, who is a sociologist based out of Baylor, I think, he's written he's written several books on the history of Christianity, and he's written a book called The Triumph of Christianity, and in that he talks about the reasons that Christianity was able to see such success. Now, obviously, we believe that God had a major hand in that, but he looks at some of the sociological, some of the circumstantial and sort of environmental reasons why, and one of the reasons why is the fact that Christianity elevated women to a place that other ways of looking at the world, worldviews, and religions did not. And so we have a number of instances in the New Testament of women being elevated to places that they would probably not have been able to achieve had they been Jews or Romans. So this is a good reminder of that here is a congregation that's meeting in this woman's home. It also reminds us that, yes, in the early church, people met in homes. As Jesus said, where 2 or 3 are gathered, there am I in their midst. And if there's ever been a good time to meditate on this fact, it's right now, as we all find ourselves stuck in our homes. That just because we are in our homes and we only maybe have a handful of people to gather with, that does not at all take away from the presence of the church, right? We are the church. The building is not the church. It's one of the unfortunate things about the word church and the way that it's used in so many different ways in English, because it has led to there being, I think, a confusion about what the church really is. And what this verse reminds us of is that, yes, even if there's just a handful of people in a home, you're still the church. Why? Because we are the temple of God. We don't go to the temple of God. So this is just a really important thing. And I know it's sometimes hard for us to fully get, that we still have this tendency towards viewing the place of worship with a sort of sacred kind of a mentality. And to some degree, it's not necessarily bad. It just can become bad because we can begin to put all the focus on the building and on the place and on everything, all the accoutrements of the place. And churches split over the color of the carpet and over what kind of chairs you're going to have and over everything else. And we've totally lost sight of the fact that for the first, century or more, people were worshiping in homes, and they didn't have a whole lot of options about all of the stuff that we spend so much time focusing on. And so this is a good reminder of that fact. Now, notice what he says here towards the end. And I feel like I'm going long. What time is it? Yeah. He says, when this letter is read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans. And you, for your part, read my letter that is coming from Laodicea. This is what's called Colossians is a circular letter. The reason it's called that is because it would be passed from one congregation to another. It's obvious, even from this early date, that Paul's letters were functioning as Scripture. That the congregations receive them as Scripture. They receive them as authoritative, as truly being able to explain what happened in Christ and what God is doing and what God expects and everything else. And so Paul sends this circular letter to the Colossians, and he wants them to they make a copy of it, and then they take it and they send it to the congregation in Laodicea, which, remember, is not very far away. Now, notice what else he says. That he says, I want you to read my letter that is coming from the Laodiceans. In other words, Paul wrote a letter to the Laodiceans, and he also sent it to and it was also supposed to pass through. Now, we might ask, well, do we have the letter to the Laodiceans? I mean, what is this? Well, there are some scholars, and I think that there's a pretty good case to be made, that the letter from the Laodiceans is actually, wait for it, the book of Ephesians. Why is that? Well, in the earliest manuscripts that we have of the book of Ephesians, and just a number of them, there is no addressee. In a lot of those early manuscripts, it doesn't say to the Ephesians, it just says to the saints, or whatever his opening happens to be there. And so there is sort of speculation that Paul, and here's part of the other reason why, that this letter to the Laodiceans that he wrote to the Laodiceans is actually the book of Ephesians. Part of the reason people think that is because if you read Ephesians and you read Colossians, what you'll find is that they share a lot in common. In fact, they're sort of like sister letters. They deal with a lot of the same themes. It's almost like Colossians just digs down deeper on one particular idea. Kind of almost the way you can see it is that Colossians deals with Jesus and how Jesus is exalted and what that means. And Ephesians is more of what the church is about and how Christ is working through the church. And so both of these letters, they have a lot of similarities, and if you get the opportunity to sit down and read them both immediately, one after the other, you will see those similarities. And it will probably, if you've never read them before like that, be striking to you just how many parallels there are between these books. So kind of the idea is that Paul sat down and he wrote both of these letters while he was at Ephesus, and obviously the Ephesians got a copy of this. This may be the reason why that it got the name attached to it, because that was probably the first place that had it. But then he also would have sent that elsewhere, including to Laodicea. And so then it began to circulate there. And once it went to Laodicea, it didn't have, it wouldn't have been associated with Ephesus. And as a result, it was just being passed around. And so then eventually the Colossians would have read it too. That is the speculation. Can we know for a fact? No, but I think that there is strong evidence in that regard, especially with the similarities between these two letters. And like I said, if you get the chance to sit down and read them both side by side, you'll see for yourself just how many similarities there are. Now we come to these final two verses. Paul says, I want you to say to Archippus, take heed to the ministry which you've received in the Lord, that you may fulfill it. If you go over to Philemon verse 2, there's only one chapter in the book of Philemon. It's just one, there's no more than one chapter. It's not really a chapter, it's just one letter. Archippus is mentioned there as one of the ministers who's there. So what he's probably doing, Archippus is probably one of the pastors or the pastor of this congregation, and he is giving this final encouragement to Archippus, who is here at Colossae in this congregation, to continue to take heed to the ministry which you've received. In other words, stand strong. I mean, this is almost like Paul is, closing this letter with a word to the pastor saying, hey, keep up the good work, fight the good fight. And then finally we have this closing, which is something that Paul does several times in his letters. He'll say something like this, I write this greeting with my own hand. See, it's highly likely that Paul did not write most of his letters. He didn't sit down with a pen and a piece of paper or a papyrus and write them down. Instead, what happened was he would have what is it called? An amanuensis, I think is what the technical term is. It's basically a secretary. And it's somebody who Paul would dictate the letter, and this person would then write whatever Paul had dictated. And, there's a whole rabbit trail we could go down with that. But Paul would have dictated this letter, and then at the end, he would have signed it. So it's kind of like almost, you could imagine it in terms of typing a letter, and then you hit print, and you get the printed letter out, and you get a pen and sign your name at the end, to give it that personal touch that this is from me, that this isn't just a formulated letter, a form letter that I'm sending out and that, is printed up, but it actually has my signature on it to signify that this has my authority behind it. That this is the reason that Paul would do this. And so there's several places in several of his letters, Paul will say, I'm writing to you, I'm writing this with my own hand. In one place he says, see with which large letters I write this to you. And so, Paul was obviously, his handwriting was different than the handwriting of the scribe, and it was much larger, his handwriting was. And so he actually brought that out in the closing of one of his letters. So Paul is writing this greeting in his own hand to give it that personal touch. And he says, I want you to do two things, or I want you to do this one thing. Remember my imprisonment. Again, what does he want him to do? It's not just a matter of remembering it, like, oh yeah, Paul's in prison. What he's wanting to do, if you go back earlier into the chapter, is what? pray. Remember, he says, pray that the word will have an open door and that I'll be able to continue this ministry. And so when he says, remember my imprisonment, this isn't just about recalling something, recalling a fact of history or of present current events. This is instead remembering Paul in their prayers. And again, it brings up this whole importance of prayer that we find throughout the end of this chapter especially. And then Paul closes his letter with a very common way of closing it, and that is, grace be with you. This is something that's often used at the beginning of letters, because in Greek, the word for grace, I think it's the word for grace, is actually a greeting. Because when they would open the letter with grace and peace, peace was the traditional Hebrew greeting, shalom, and grace was the traditional Greek greeting. And so Paul is closing this letter the way that he often did, with a prayer for God's grace to be with them and to continue to empower them to do everything that he's just described and put into words. All of these encouragements and exhortations and reminders and everything else. They will definitely need the grace of God to accomplish all of that. And thus we come to the end of the book of Colossians. Man, oh man, what an awesome, awesome letter Paul has left us with. And I would love to go into Ephesians, but I actually, on my other Facebook page, I actually went through the entire book of Ephesians a couple of years ago, and all those videos are still on there. If anybody's interested in looking at those, I can certainly give you the link, and you're more than welcome to go look at those. You can see some of those parallels that we brought out. Other than that, the only thing I've got left is, again, if you got any questions or topics that you'd like us to look at or books of the Bible, please let me know. If nobody else says anything, then we'll probably start James on Friday. We'll do Philemon on Thursday and look at it and then dig into James if nobody else has anything. And hey, even if you've just got a question that you'd like me to cover, even if it's just a short thing, we could do something like that at the beginning or at the end and then go through a book for the rest of it. I mean, there's so many different options we can do. The only other thing I've got for you is I want to remind you that tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, we will be continuing our Theology for Dummies. We'll be looking at how we can understand the Bible. How are we drawing conclusions about God by reading the Bible? And what do we do with all this data, this information that we get from the Old Testament and the New Testament? So we'll be looking at that. I want to invite you to come back. I think it's going to be good. It's one of my favorite topics. So please join us for that. And as always, like, share. If you don't like our page on Facebook, like the church page, and so that the word can get out and we can share the gospel through this digital means that we have and that we're being able to take advantage of right now. Anyway, I love y'all and I appreciate you and I'm looking forward to seeing you. Hopefully it won't be long. God bless you. We'll see you tomorrow night at 7 o'clock.